Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, today's the day I'm finally sitting down and I'm finally doing it. Today, we're going to be talking about arguably one of the most important books in terms of the history of comics, specifically Western comics. And when we talk about Western comics, again, we're primarily talking about comics that were generated in terms of the United States, but that ultimately had a long lasting impact upon the tone of comics production and then just the general literary landscape in terms of the United States and then the rest of the world. What book left such an impact? Well, today we're going to be talking about Will Eisner, specifically A Contract with God. Now, it's really important moving forward that I don't want to oversell this book. A Contract with God appeared on the scene, and while it did have something of a big impact in terms of the legacy of comics, it didn't necessarily shake things up. In fact, it's taken a while for this book to actually sort of gain the respectability that it has, and that's again due in large part to the underappreciation and oftentimes the snobbery that is dealt towards the medium of comics overall. When Will Eisner, the author of this book, as well as subsequent or earlier works such as The Spirit, which you'll see pictured here, when this book originally came out, Will Eisner had to fight tooth and nail for any semblance of respectability, and longtime colleagues who had been working in the comics industry laughed at him when Will said, I think this medium can be art. Because even cartoonists at the time didn't see comics as a means of using or didn't observe it as art. They thought it was merely a cheap, easy throwaway medium that was largely a sort of stepping stone to the more air quote professional style career of an actual artist. Or oftentimes cartooning in comics was largely a stepping stone, possibly towards animation, but far more often towards advertising art. A Contract with God is a really monumental artistic statement, largely for the fact that when Will Eisner published this book out, he was saying, hey, comics are art, and we can use this to explain and express aspects of our humanity. So, right off the bat, I really hope going into this video you appreciate how important this book was and how important Will Eisner was towards the medium of comics gaining the semblance of respectability that it really hadn't possessed. As I've noted before, a lot of times comics were, for the most part, a cheap medium. They were either newspaper comic strips, kind of like The Spirit, like this one, where Will Eisner really began to sort of establish and sort of hone his technique as an artist, but for the most part, they were really more gag comics than anything else. And then, of course, you also had superhero comics, which, again, were largely perceived as children's literature. It wasn't even considered literature. It was just cheap, empty fluff entertainment that didn't really have the capacity in order to sort of address deeper truths about the human condition. Will Eisner was one of the first people to actually say, no, bullshit. We can do better, and we can use this medium to do all sorts of things. So, with all that lovely sort of setup for it, it's also important to recognize this book is pretty old. The original copyright listed in this copy, which is a Norton and Company edition, lists the original copyright at about 1978. I honestly think the book came out 1 or 2 years before that, but we have to remember there, again, when this book came out, we're talking about the 1970s. And the 1970s is really when comics, for the most part, was, again, either gag strips in the newspaper, or they were a lot of times the sort of, I can't remember, I believe the 1970s is really more like the golden and silver age, but you're really seeing the rise of the Marvel Universe, especially with characters like Thor, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, what have you. And then DC as well. While it wasn't a great decade for DC in the 1970s, you were seeing the establishments of things like the Justice League and the Green Lantern series and the Flash, and of course characters like Batman and Wonder Woman and Superman, which had been established for a long time, were really hitting a lot of their stride and figuring out what role they had in the culture. So when we look at this book, again, also try to understand that historically speaking, A Contract with God was something of an outlier because the book wasn't about superheroes or talking animals or fantastic surreal landscapes. It was primarily a story about immigrants, traditionally, or for the most part, Jewish immigrants, living in a small tenement apartment complex in Bronx, New York. Or, I believe it's the Bronx. Yes, Dropsy Avenue in the Bronx. So, again, Contract with God is going to be a weird book for that element as well. So, we have to contextualize this book as something of, again, I used the word before, but it's fitting, an outlier. This book was not like every other book that was out there on the market at that time. And for that reason alone, it also made the book stand out and continues to make it stand out to this day. But those are the long introductory notes for this. I will go ahead and post a link to the Wikipedia article for Will Eisner as well as A Contract with God. I would definitely recommend checking it out because in the very bottom there will be a recommended reading section, and that will have tons of books relating to the career of Will Eisner as well as just general articles that you can look up. And believe you me, when it comes to comics, you cannot not talk about comics without talking about Will Eisner. So, with this sort of opening argument established, let's talk a little bit about what exactly is the content of A Contract with God and why exactly should we care about it. So, when we talk about A Contract with God, we're talking about a graphic novel, and that title is absolutely important. Remember, when we've discussed books on this channel before, for the most part, whenever we're talking about superhero comics, we're talking about bound trades. That means you're talking about a series of independent comics that were then sort of collected into some kind of whole or organization, usually 4 comics that follow a main arc, and then 1 comic which was kind of a bridge between the larger stories. A Contract with God was different because it was not meant to be read as a series of independent comics that came out month by month by month. This was, in effect, the start of the graphic novel. The idea that we could tell one singular story, or at least for the most part, a collection of stories with the understanding that it was an overall whole. A Contract with God is not one story. It's 4 vignettes that is sort of centered around the small tenement in Bronx, New York called 55 Dropsy Avenue. Will Eisner in this book is telling the stories of various immigrants who had come to the United States and were living through the early days of the Depression and just trying to sort of survive. It explores their interactions with one another. It explores the sort of American experience that these people were sort of living as they had sought some kind of new life here in the United States. And then as well, it's trying to sort of understand how their closeness, just in terms of their sheer approximation to one another, impacted their day-to-day life and how it affected their humanity and perceptions of self. But what's important here, again, is that these 4 vignettes, though disconnected and not about the same people, are all connected by the idea of 55 Dropsy Avenue. Now, I'm not going to go into it here, but the opening of this book, Eisner talks a little bit, or he provides, actually there's about 3 or 4 different prologues, because this book has gone through a number of reprints, but he talks a little bit about how each of these stories sort of came about, and, well, let's see. Maybe I can read one small passage here to sort of give you an idea of what Will Eisner's sort of goal for these stories is. He notes the page is 9, but it's IX because it's an introduction. That's how you do. Anyway, in 1978, encouraged by the work of the experimental graphic artists Otto Nuckel, Franz Massarel, and Lind Ward, who in the 1930s published serious novels told in art without text, I attempted a major work in a similar form. In a futile effort to entice the patronage of a mainstream publisher, I called it a graphic novel. It was a collection of 4 related stories drawn from memory which took place in a single tenement in the Bronx. The title of the book, named for the lead story, became A Contract with God. Though no major publisher would touch it at the time, the novel has remained in print for 27 years and has been published in 11 different languages. I followed this first effort with more ambitiously constructed graphic novels. All are anchored on a single street in the borough of the Bronx in New York City. The street is Dropsy Avenue, a caricature of a neighborhood that is nevertheless very real to me. So that small paragraph, in effect, gives you an idea of what the story is about, or what this collection is about. Will Eisner effectively created a street in New York and then sort of centered a lot of his creative goals around that street. Where before, Eisner had largely been working in newspaper strips, so his story, particularly the character of the Spirit, was a superhero comic, but it was a superhero comic that was published in the newspaper. So Will Eisner, for the most part, had been working in a sort of episodic nature, and oftentimes in a kind of very gag nature as well. with A Contract with God, Will Eisner wanted to explore some of the deeper aspects of humanity, or sometimes even just the monotony of day-to-day existence, and how people can oftentimes be disappointed or sort of undone by their own ambitions. The first story in question, like he said, which gains the actual title of the book itself, is A Contract with God. This story is ultimately the story of a Jewish immigrant by the name of Frem Hirsch. Now, Frem Hirsch, you might hear some click-clacking. That's my little dog Sonia came. Oh, no, actually, it's my dog Huckleberry. Let me just say, hey, Huckleberry, say hi to the internet. He's very cute. All right. The story of Frem Hirsch, oh gosh, I think my phone, there we go. The story of Frem Hirsch is a story about a Jewish immigrant who came to the United States with the help of his original rabbi, and when he was on his way to the United States, he made, on a little piece of rock, an air quote, contract with God. This was his way of noting, or his way of kind of trying to make a deal with God, sort of his way of going like, okay, I'm a good person, therefore God will be kind to me. I will make a contract with him, and he will maintain it. Well, Frem comes to the United States. He lives his life. He becomes a model citizen in his community. And then one day, a young girl is dropped on his doorstep. He raises the young woman, and then she eventually contracts a disease and passes away. To which case, Frem is ultimately betrayed. And in a scene that is hearkening to the original cover of the book, Frem feels that he has been betrayed by God and that the contract that he made is broken. Frem renounces his Judaism and then basically becomes the owner of 55 Dropsy Avenue and basically becomes a real estate mogul. He begins purchasing other properties and becoming richer and richer, but more and more dissatisfied, till eventually he pays several of the rabbis in his community to make a new contract with God. And as he argues, aha, you will not violate our contract this time, leading, of course, Frem to suffer a spontaneous heart attack and pass away. It's not an uplifting story, obviously. But in its way, you can observe one of the first themes that it explores is the notion of the self, the notion of individual integrity, and then as well how spirituality was sort of living and operating in the mind of one individual immigrant, begging into question of how each person has to establish their own relationship with the divine. Now, I'm an atheist, so I don't believe in the divine, period. But there are people out in this world who do believe in God, and they do have their own relationship with God, such as it is. So to them, have fun. But nevertheless, this book is a really interesting meditation on the notion of faith and what human beings expect out of faith and how they can allow their faith, or sometimes their lack of faith, or the challenges to their faith to determine the events of their life. Now that's the first story. The second vignette, which of course is titled, I didn't write it down, so I just have to sort of wander through the book. Let's see. Is, yes, The Street Singer. Now this is taken directly from Will Eisner's real-life experience living in a tenement, which was during the period of the Great Depression. There would be men who would go through these tenements and basically just sing in the alleyways for pennies. People would throw down coins, sometimes they'd throw down dollar bills. The street singer follows this pattern. However, this particular street singer finds a note from a former opera singer who has sort of fallen down into the hard parts of her career. She informs him that she's going to basically use her connections to make him a new opera singer. It'll be the rebirth of her career. She gives him some money and tells him to come back the next day. She eventually books a gig, and she feels at this moment that at last she's going to be back on top. We then follow the street singer, whose name is Eddie, and we observe him going to a liquor store, coming home to purchase something to drink. Oh, that was my card. I'll have to put it back. And, well, getting drunk off of his ass, punching his wife, and then throwing his child across the room. Eddie then goes to a bar the next day, brags about how he's going to be a great opera singer, and then discovers, oh, crud, I didn't write down the name of the apartment complex that I went to. In which case, then, he picks himself up, goes to another place in the Bronx, and starts singing again. I should probably let you know, Will Eisner didn't necessarily tell a lot of happy stories, and that's one of the beefs I sometimes have with his writing, or sometimes the beef I have sitting down to read his works, is I know going into it, this is not necessarily going to be a happy story. And on the note of very not happy stories, we should talk about the third vignette, The Super. Now, this is a story about the building Super. Now, if you've never lived in an apartment complex, and honestly I never have myself, but I know from firsthand experience, or excuse me, I know from secondhand experience from friends who have lived in apartment complexes, you usually have a Super. He's the person, he or she are the person, they are the person, excuse me, gender pronouns important. They are the individual responsible for the upkeep of the apartments. And with this particular man, we have a man by the name of Mr. Scruggs. He's not terribly pleasant man. He doesn't really like his job. He's oftentimes sort of alone and constantly angry. In one particular panel, you observe him just sitting outside, being sad. And then you see him sort of getting into an altercation with one of the tenants in period. Now, he observes her young niece in a rather creepy fashion, and he goes down to his apartment, which, as you can see, is loaded with images of naked women. We see him get drunk, and then we see him go down, and suddenly he receives a knock on his door, and sure enough, it's the young niece from the apartment he was just in. She makes him an offer of, "Do you wanna?" Basically saying, "Do you want to see?" Now, she lifts up her shirt. We don't see anything. We just observe his reaction to it, which is, ew, gross and pervy. But then once she shows him, he goes ahead and pays her. She offers his dog a candy, and then when he turns around, she steals his money box full of money and then discovers that she has poisoned his dog. He then runs up to try to stop her or sort of punish her, and she starts to scream out, and all the tenants in the neighborhood think that he's attacking her without provocation, which then causes him to go down, turn on all the pipes, lock himself in his apartment complex, and then, sure enough, as the cops come to the door, we see him crying, holding his dog, and then he blows his brains out. The final panel being perhaps the most pernicious one, the young girl counting out the money. Yeah, like I said, Will Eisner doesn't really tell happy stories. That's the third story. I'm not going to go into the plot of the last, or I'm not going to go into extensive detail of the last one. The last title is Cookaline. It's the story that I honestly don't care that much about because it focuses on a bunch of individual people who are leaving the tenants during the sort of winter, or excuse me, during the summer season, and going out to the Catskills. It's this region in the sort of New York area where people would go in the summer to do sort of side jobs in the country, make a little bit of extra money, and then also just get out of New York. It focuses a young aspiring doctor. It focuses on a young woman who's working in the fabric industry. It focuses on a man who's been cheating on his wife for years, trying to find a new way to find satisfaction in his marriage. And it focuses on a young man who's sort of trying to find his way in life. It's not my favorite part of the story, but it's interesting for the way it explores how these people would leave the tenements hoping to find something in the country, but then ultimately finding their own idiosyncrasies and problems there as well. It's not the strongest, but looking at it in relation to the rest of the story, it makes sense. I've spent 12 minutes now talking about the whole story. I hope these plot summaries are interesting to you, or at least mildly entertaining. I promise I'm not trying to kill your time. What I'm just trying to show you is the sort of tones of these stories. These are not particularly pleasant. And as I pointed out at the very beginning, Will Eisner is making new ground by effectively creating a comic story, calling it a graphic novel, and that way sort of connecting it to all the other novels which had existed at that point, and then also creating a new creative realm for comics. Because again, if we look at what had come before, we're mostly talking about newspaper comic strips and superhero comic strips. These are stories that were either very melodramatic, in which case you followed a story through ups and downs and what have you, or it was very gag-driven. It was a short story that was designed to get you to the very last panel where you go, haha, that's funny. This doesn't follow either of those formats. These stories really follow a more literary tradition, which is oftentimes that life can be disappointing, that humanity can be disappointing, that life can be disappointing. So rather than try to create a series of heroes for his reader to follow, Will Eisner creates four stories of real human beings who are constantly trying to just sort of survive in this urban environment and find some semblance of self that is personally satisfying, and oftentimes being disappointed or outright destroyed for their efforts. It's not a pleasant story, but it is a very human story. And while at times I do feel the tone can be a little more melodramatic, which may simply just be an aspect of his generation, I do feel that content wise, this book is really important for the way it broke new ground in what is possible in terms of the realm of comics. Rather than just telling a story about a superhero overcoming wonderful odds, we have a more human. No, I don't like that language. We have a different story structure in which we have a not terribly likable character, in fact, sometimes several not terribly likable characters, who are ultimately undone by the ambitions or their attempts to sort of overcome the challenges in their life rather than recognizing them for what they are. That right now is the sort of summation I have for content. I do hope sometime in the future to do a sort of follow-up video to talk a little bit more about it. But for now, content-wise, A Contract with God is really important because of the way it tells really human stories in a way that feel approachable and also sort of fresh for their particular time periods. A contemporary reader is probably going to look at these stories and go, they're common sort of slice of life stories. Who cares about that? You should care about it because this is one of the first books, if not the first book, to really try to break into that tradition. So, with the content down, let's talk about why formally A Contract with God is really interesting and why you should definitely take notice of it. Whew. Okay, so we've talked now about why, content-wise, A Contract with God is a really important graphic novel for its time. But we also need to discuss why, formally, A Contract with God is really interesting and had long-term effects upon the medium of comics. Now, you'll note the book to my right. Normally, these are just something fun in the background and also wait for me to show off my awesome book collection. Ugh, I need friends. Anyway, you'll note this book here, Comics and Sequential Art. Whenever you read books about the history of comics, eventually this book is going to make an appearance. And the reason for that is simple. Will Eisner, during the course of his life, was never satisfied with just the simple panel structure of comics. Or maybe to put it another way, what he was really concerned with was how cartoonists could use the panel structure in order to tell stories, not just in terms of creating characters, putting them into these boxes and moving them along, but how the shape, format, and arrangement, as well as the body language, tone, and visual representation contained therein the panels were just as important. And anybody who's interested in terms of the form of comics, the history of comics, or just comics period, it would really behoove you to sit down and get a copy of this book. I guarantee you, your local comic book might have it, local comic book shop might have it, your local public library might have it, and then if you can't find it there, try your local Barnes & Noble or bookstore because they might have it on stock as well. You can usually find it in like an art section. But whatever the case, this book is really important because it outlines a lot of Will Eisner's effort to sort of understand what is the medium of comics and how does it operate. I can't talk today. It's very similar in that regard to my man Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics as well. The only difference is that while Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics goes into a lot of heavy detail using comics, this book is a little bit more, air quote, traditional in the fact it's mostly prose. But when we talk about Will Eisner, we're talking about a man who is constantly thinking about how do I make a comic and what are the limitations of it, and maybe another way of thinking about it is, what can I do in comics? You'll note, just from a couple of the pages I've shown already, Will Eisner was really interested in using visual language, not just in terms of like text and body language, but using every image on the page in order to tell his story. You'll note here, he's using this image of the rock that Frim Hirsch would eventually write his contract with God upon in order to start the story. But along with creating the textures of the rock itself, you'll note he's also using script, which is very reminiscent of Hebrew. I don't know why I couldn't talk about it. But yes, Hebrew script is purposefully employed here because Frimphersch's narrative is very much about his alienation from God, his alienation from his Jewishness, and that, of course, is going to set up the plate. And then, of course, the rain. This is something that's carried on for the first several passages of the story. In one beautiful instance, this page right here, you can see how the text looks like it's melting across the page. Both of my dogs are now sort of... You having fun there, Huckleberry? Sonia's here too. Say hi, Sonia. You may hear him kind of hopping up and down a little bit. But what's really important here is when we look at this page, Will Eisner is not just using words as a way of setting up the story. He's using the visuals of the word to set the tone of the story. We can tell already this is not going to be a happy tale because it's almost as if the story is crying from the very beginning, from the very fact that it has to be told. Frimphersch at the start of the story is walking home after his daughter's funeral. And so page after page after page is just drenched with this morose, sorrowful rain. And it's important as well to note we have page after page. If we were following a more sort of traditional comic book, say like a newspaper comic strip, we would have panel, panel, panel. Will Eisner states in the introductions to this book that he was wanting to try to play with the form of comics, rather than having to try to sort of pack all of this rain and scenery into one panel. He wanted to take an entire page. Now, we, a modern day or contemporary reader, are going to be like, okay, well, so what? I can pull out a Green Lantern comic book and they have, literally a 2-page spread of Superman punching Sinestro across the face, or maybe we have Atrocitus fighting Darkseid or something like that. Actually, that would be kind of fun. I would totally watch Atrocitus fight Darkseid. He'd probably lose, but fuck it, I don't care. It would be awesome. Anyway, when we're looking at this page, though, we have to remember that up to this point, a full-page spread or a full page for one single panel was still a relatively new concept. Cartoonists were sort of contained in the panel, and they were also contained around the exterior of the panel, the square. But again, if we look at these pages, you'll note we don't have a contained panel. Rather, we have the outlines of the scenes. They sort of bleed into the white as if they're these kind of like dream-esque visions. And this is really visually significant and had a tremendous impact upon the next generation and then subsequent generations of cartoonists, because they began to realize we are not limited to the square of the panel. And you can see him employ this throughout every single story of this book. If I can show the page again where Frimphersch has sort of come to a moment where he feels that he has won, he's finally beat God out with a new contract, we note it begins again originally with this huge open page. We're not contained by any panels, and then in the next one, as he's continuing to further boast, we see he's suddenly contained in panels. The heart attack is also contained in panels, but you'll note they kind of bleed into one another. Will Eisner wasn't really content with just setting up the squares, and every Will Eisner book I have ever read follows the same platform. He will occasionally use a square panel, but for the most part, he doesn't really bother with them. Instead, he allows the dialogue balloons and the body language of the characters to effectively do the story for him. Now, part of this is also the fact that the first story, A Contract with God, is a very dramatic story in terms of its tone. When we see the second story, The Street Singer, we fall back a little bit more into these square panels. But even then, you can observe here on this page, we have this really long, page-long panel of the note sort of falling down upon the singer. She's opened the window so that she can drop the note. She drops the note, it falls down, and he catches it. Again, if we were working with a different cartoonist of that generation, everything would have been contained in a square. And if we think of a lot of those Marvel comics or DC comics from the 1970s, even some of the most grandiose scenes would have been contained within the panel. Will Eisner, again, is playing with the structure. Sorry, my cat Jones is now hopping on top of me. No, but you see, again, what's important here is the fact that we are not being tied down or limited to that single panel. Eisner is allowing the tone of his stories, and more importantly, the tone of each scene, to dictate the arrangement on the page. You'll note in this 3-page panel where Eddie is just shooting back shots and listening to his wife complain about how he doesn't go out for work, he just sings, he doesn't care about us, I was young, I was beautiful, and then it leads to him throwing the baby across the room. If we go on to the next page as well, it continues these sort of horizontal panels. Again, we're sort of watching the scene sort of develop. And part of it's mostly because he's letting the wife's dialogue create the scene. Eddie, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, repeats over and over again. And so these elongated rectangular panels are really designed to ultimately lead us towards the big hit. Now, another page I wanted to talk about, I've got several that I can discuss because they're all so beautiful, but one of the most painful 2-page spreads in this book is from the Super. This, again, is where, let's see, Mr. Scuggs, Mr. Scuggs has just been discovered by the neighborhood attacking the young girl who's poisoned his dog, and so we see him defeated. This man is in the lowest emotional point that he's going to be for the remainder of his life, which is not very long. Like, he's literally going to commit suicide on these pages. And you can see, again, how Eisner allows the emotion of the scene to sort of break free of the panels. And this particular shot where Scuggs is holding his dogs, pressing the gun to his temple, and sort of making one last final declaration of agency, he breaks free of the panels. Now, part of this may simply be because he's trying to sort of make a comment about the sort of confined nature of the tenement of 55 Dropsy Avenue and how people are sort of continually fighting against that contained space. But I think it's also just him trying to come up with something new and try to create some new sort of visual language. Cartoonists are no longer held by those solid lines of the panel, and instead they're allowed to just sort of play with the arrangement on the page. And again, you'll note what's important here is that Mr. Scuggs' suicide doesn't receive a full page like, say, Frim Hirsch's declaration of, "No, you can't do this to me," does. Mr. Scuggs is more or less just trapped down in his little hole in the basement. And that in itself becomes a kind of narrative approach to the story, as we're able to observe how his emotional devastation in his last fight is really contained. It's like his whole world is crumbling down on top of him, and he's not even given that last little bit of space to just make the final blow. Now, one last page I wanted to talk about here in terms of its formalistic elements, we're going to go back to The Street Singer for a moment, is this page here. Eddie is talking to a bartender and talking about how he's just discovered the woman, Diva Marta Maria, and how she's going to change his career and he's going to have so much money and he'll be able to pay the bartender back for all of the drinks that he owes him. And then when the bartender asks him, okay, so who is she? Where does she live? Eddie goes, "Oh my God." And it's one panel, so it's not terribly important. But you can see as well, one of the most important things about Eisner is that he's probably one of the most beautiful cartoonists that I'm aware of in terms of human expression. If I can go back to, say, this page here, where Frim Hirsch is observing his contract, you can see him and the way he bites the page and the way he seems so happy. You can tell by the way he's looking up, the way the tear falls down his cheek. What's interesting about Eisner is that he didn't try to elevate the human form into anything that it wasn't. He really played with the distortion that can take place in the human body. If you look at this beautiful page of Mr. Scuggs, he's not an attractive man. He's quite ugly and repulsive, and yet the page in and of itself is really beautiful. He seems like a tremendously expressive soul. And then if we look at another page here, let's see. Yes, Diva Marta Maria is on the phone talking to one of her former co-workers in the opera scene for the most part, and we can see again how well he does at using body language to express emotion. This is something that's really important because in terms of the comic scene, for the most part, cartoonists were usually drawing super muscular men or, vivacious dames in tight, skin-tight outfits. That was it. That was pretty much the realm that you were working with in terms of the human body, or you were dealing with in newspaper strips, characters like Popeye, which were for the most part 3 or 4 lines with ridiculous proportions. Eisner's artwork is really important for the way it managed to capture real emotion and the way it managed to convey real emotion of the characters itself. So if we go back to Eddie, who's again trying to remember where he was supposed to go in order to get a drink, we can see just how powerful Will Eisner's visual style is in order to convey the emotion and in order to convey the story that we're seeing. We feel Eddie's emotional devastation because Will Eisner is an amazing artist, and every single one of his book manages to explore this possibility for expression and how important body language is as well as expression is in order to strengthen the story. I could keep going for hours, but at like 13 minutes, you guys are probably already getting annoyed with me. So let's just put it in this effect. A Contract with God is beautiful in terms of its formal arrangement, its formal gestures and experiments, but then also simply for the fact that Will Eisner is a beautiful artist who manages to really explore how humans are and how they express themselves and how their body can really convey this, and then more importantly, strengthen the tone of a story or passage. All right, let's do the last hurrah and then call it a day. What need more be said? I can't recommend A Contract with God enough. It's arguably one of the most important graphic novels, largely because it was one of the first instances of a graphic novel. It's important for the effect that it had upon generation after generation of cartoonists that came after the fact. It is, formally speaking, a beautiful opportunity to observe the form of comics and how, when done right, careful play and experimentation in the form can yield tremendous impact upon the reader in terms of emotional reaction and in terms of a strengthened narrative. And then, as well, the strength of Will Eisner as an artist in terms of his representation of the body, natural landscapes, and human expression leaves every single page of this book just absolutely beautiful experience. I can't say anything else except, seriously, take the time and effort to read A Contract with God. If you are a lover of comics, or even if you've just had a passing interest in comics, this is probably a wonderful place to start, because it gives you an opportunity and it gives you an approachable book to show you that comics, while it can be a wonderful avenue for little gag jokes and a wonderful opportunity to explore superhero melodrama, it's also a really wonderful opportunity to explore real human themes, real human eccentricity and idiosyncrasy, and sometimes the tragedies and joys that is the human experience. I don't know what else to say. Read this book. You'll love it. Or at the very least, you'll appreciate it. Or at the very least, it'll kill 20 minutes. Well, probably a little bit longer than that. But still, it's a wonderful read. Check it out. On that note, thank you all for watching. This video was a bit longer than I wanted it to be. I apologize for taking so long with the content, but as you can tell, I really love Will Eisner and this book, and as all the books here have pointed out, I'm a huge lover of his work. When it comes to A Contract with God, most comic book shops should carry it. Will Eisner is just too important not to stock. If they don't have it, though, I guarantee you your local comic book shop could probably place it on order for you. If you don't have a local comic book shop in your town, you probably have, at the very least, access to a public library. And as he noted, this book has been translated multiple times, so it doesn't matter what country you're in, you might have a copy of this at your local public library. So go, check it out. If they don't have it, ask for an interlibrary loan form, and they should be able to get it to you. As always, to regular viewers and even new viewers, I've started a Patreon. It's largely designed to help me with my art. I draw, I also paint, but also the Patreon is there to help me with these videos as well, because paint is expensive, comics are expensive sometimes, and I want to just keep doing it here. So if you like this channel, if you like my art, there's a link in the description section below. I only ask for $1 a month. Please, please, please. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your time. As always, like, share, and subscribe. All that jazz. It helps me know that you like these videos, that you want to see more. Maybe you just want to see me be a goof in front of camera for 30 minutes. I don't know. Whatever you do you. But hey, help me out. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. go read some comics.